Good morning. Again, SALT 2.0. Now we're not talking about, I can look this way, we are talking about salt. Does anybody notice anything weird about what Jesus says? What Jesus says makes no sense when you think about it. How can salt become unsalty? What is salt? Come on. Sodium chloride. Can you unsodium chloride sodium chloride? What? Oh, to sodium and chloride, right? But I don't think that's what it's talking about, because Jesus is talking about like you put salt on food and it becomes less salty. Salt doesn't become less salty. Salt is always salt, never changes. As long as it's salt and in that crystalline form, like this, it's sodium chloride. So this isn't a science lesson. This is a spiritual lesson that Jesus is teaching us. And it has all kinds of ramifications, but so we're going to explore that. What does it mean for this salt not to be salty? And what does the salt mean? Well, it's not salt 2. Salt 2.0, this is not this salt, okay? You can read it up here. June 17, 1979. I'm in the wrong season. Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev signed the SALT II treaty in Vienna. SALT II limited the total of both nations' nuclear forces to 2,250 delivery vehicles and placed a variety of other restrictions on deployed strategic nuclear forces, including MIRVs. Anybody know what MIRVs are? What? That's right. Say that louder, Sam. Right. So one missile goes up and 5 come down. That's what the MIRVs are. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about 2 kinds of salt. Now, when I was a young kid, we lived in Jett, Oklahoma. And Jett, Oklahoma is famous for a couple things, believe it or not. It has about 300 people. That's not what it's famous for. It used to have an Air Force base there, a reserve Air Force base. And they did Air Force training, pilot training in Jett, Oklahoma. But it's famous for the Great Salt Lake of Oklahoma. And there at the Great Salt Lake of Oklahoma is what we call an area that we didn't go to it when we were there, but we did go to the Salt Lake. Marlis and I visited there. We looked at the other side of it. And when I was a kid, we would go and we would dig these crystals up at the Salt Lake. It was a lot of fun. And this is what the crystals look like. Now, we dug up some that looked like airplanes. They would go like this. They'd have different wings on them. It's just a lot of fun. But of course, we'd bring them home, and I don't think any of them, none of my siblings or I, have any of those crystals that we dug up because they're kind of fragile. They don't stick together really well. But you'd put them in a bucket, carry them away, and with a lot of fun. Just great. Just great. Let's go back. So I want to start with a story about this. When my kids were young, I went through the Great Salt Lake, and we went out to where you dig in the salt. And when you walk across the salt flats, the bugs all die. As they're flying across the salt flats, the salt actually evaporates enough moisture out of them that if a fly starts on this side, it won't make it to that side. It's just going to dry up its moisture will be gone. And one of the kids made the mistake of walking in bare feet on the salt flats. Doesn't sound like a big thing. But in my van, they ended up putting their bare feet again when we left on the window of the van. And there was enough salt in their feet that they left their footprint and toe prints on the window of the van permanently. It etched. It etched that glass, this salt. Pretty spectacular. So this is the kind of salt we're talking about. Salt. Salt is powerful, does powerful things. So let's look at what Jesus is really talking about now that we're not talking about that you can dissolve salt, but what salt might mean to us and to them. Now, salt, when Jesus talks about this, there's more going on in the conversation than we can recognize because we are not Jews. There's a lot in this conversation. We're going to explore this. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. There's a lesson here. Jesus is saying, really pay close attention. And of course, verse 33 is about this entire chapter. Luke 14 is about the cost of discipleship. So here, you can have all kinds of different substances that look like salt, right? Just think about that. If you eat salt with your food, it's good for you if you don't eat too much. You have to have salt. Okay? And of course, Martha would tell you that you got to have a balance of sodium and potassium in your system. That regulates your fluids, your blood pressure, all those different things. But you can have a product like this, which is, what is that? I don't know what it is, but you know what it could be? How about cyanide chloride? Okay? Not a good thing to eat. Cyanide is not good for the system. It will destroy you. And so, if you had cyanide in your system, of course, it would kill you if you had enough. Maybe Epsom salts. Epsom salts is good to drink, maybe a little bit. If you have some bowel problems, it'll clear you out, but not too much. I remember when I was a kid, we would have some kind of ailment, and my mom thought Epsom salts cured all kinds of things. So you get Epsom salts every now and then. Anybody get Epsom salts to drink? No? Oh my goodness, it was the cure-all, like castor oil. It fixes what ails you. But it's definitely not good for food. How about sugar? Sugar looks like salt. Any of you ever been at a restaurant and picked up a container of sugar and accidentally, right? You're like, oh no, this sugar's on my eggs and it's not going to be good. We've all made that mistake, right? Especially as a kid. So what we really want, the real thing that we need is salt. And salt has a spiritual meaning and has had a spiritual meaning since the time of Sinai. And the people that were there with Jesus, when he said salt losing its saltiness, they would have understood what he was talking about. So this is what we want. This is really salt. You can't tell, right? You can't tell. But you can tell in the outwork of our lives if salt is really present. And so we got to talk about, what does this salt represent? And what does it represent when there's salt that really isn't salt at all? It's lost its flavor. Okay, the cost of being a disciple. Once, when a large crowd of people were going along with Jesus, he turned and said to them, those who come to me cannot be my disciples unless they love me more than they love father and mother, wife and children, brother and sister, and themselves as well. Those who do not carry their own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Total commitment in love, in spirit, in grace, in life, setting aside the world for Jesus is the salt. Is the salt. Now I'll show you why they would have known that. Okay, in the same way, going on in the same verse, concluded, Jesus, none of you can be my disciples unless you give up everything you have. That's what we read, right, Julie? That was that first part. You can't be my disciple if you don't give up everything. It's not a halfway decision. Hard for us. I don't know if you guys have noticed these discussions in 12, 13, and 14 of Luke, but they are all about discipleship and total commitment to Jesus. And it's hard. In the Sabbath school we talked about this morning, Peter, thinking he was totally committed to Jesus and finding out he was halfway. And us, we want to live our lives in such a way that Jesus is not an inconvenience for us. And Jesus is saying, I've got to be that inconvenience. I have got to be number one, because me being number one will change everything about your life so that you are loving, kind, gracious, and forgiving. We have to be realistic. We have a world that is filled with Christians, and I pray that we don't want to be one of those that say they're Christ's, but every evidence is that there's no salt inside. The salt that they say is there is not there because it's turned to something else. Mark 9:49 is another passage talking about salt. Everyone will be salted with fire. What does that mean? Everyone. This is talking about you and me, you guys. Every one of us will be salted with fire. So we're going to examine this text and then go back to see what the references are for this text. And every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. Salt is a good thing, but if it has lost its zest, how can it be seasoned again? Right? If salt is turned to sodium cyanide, right? If salt is turned to Epsom salts, if salt is turned to magnesium chloride, wow, it's not salt anymore, it's something else. So when we replace ourselves in the picture and put ourselves in front of Jesus and loving others and caring for others, living out his life in us, then we become unsalting. Salt is a good thing, but if it loses its zest, has lost its zest, how can it be seasoned again? You should have salt within yourselves and peace with one another. It is this salt in our lives, the love of Jesus, the love of others, that makes us at peace with one another. Without that salt, it doesn't work. This is something that God gives us, something that fills us. How exactly the salt is in us, what all that looks like, I don't know, but I know it is living and walking and being totally surrendered to Jesus, to be a sacrifice to Jesus. So let's go through what this means. Leviticus 2:13 says, season all your grain offerings with salt. Think about us being a living sacrifice. We'll keep coming to this. Season all your grain offerings with salt. So when Jesus would have been talking about salt to them, they would have understood that he was referencing this concept, because every offering they had to bring, they brought the grain offering and salt and put it on that offering. They brought the sacrificial offering, the lamb, the bull, the dove, and they salted their offering. It wasn't just devoid of seasoning. And the most important thing was salt, which was, it's like, wow. Numbers 18:19. All of the holy offerings that the priests that present to the Lord, I give to you and to your sons and your daughters as a permanent statute. It is a permanent covenant of salt before the Lord for you and your offspring. Salt is what makes the covenant of Jesus' relationship with us permanent. It is what makes the contract. Hard to believe. It is this salt in our lives that is the binding contract. It is what in our lives we have said, we agree to this arrangement. We are party to it. Without that salt, which is our sacrificial commitment, the arrangement is not made. The agreement is not there. So when Jesus said, you need this salt, they would have understood this. Ezekiel says, Ezekiel 43:24, you must present them before the Lord. These are sacrifices. If you look at the verses before, you'll find he's talking about animal sacrifices. The priests are to sprinkle salt on them and sacrifice them as a burnt offering to the Lord. You bring the sacrifice, and the salt represents the agreement that we have made. It is the way we say yes to God. 2 Chronicles 13:5 says, do you not know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by what? A covenant of salt. Okay? A covenant of salt. Interesting. A covenant of a substance that doesn't change. It doesn't change. It doesn't unite with other substances. Salt just stays sodium chloride. There are other instances of salt that you can think of. You can think of Elisha when he was called to the city where the well was, that the spring that was bitter and killed everything, and they had unfruitful land. And what did he do to the land? What did he do to the well? He poured salt in the well. And the Lord healed that well. Okay. Interesting, salt also represents something else, which I don't quite understand. But remember Lot's wife, Luke 17:32-37 says, I probably didn't, I get the whole thing in. Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it. Okay? This is talking about total commitment. Lot's wife was halfway committed to the Lord and halfway to the world. The salt in her had become spoiled. And whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it, the cost of discipleship. Lot's wife lost her life because she had not sacrificed her life to Jesus. She couldn't decide whether she wanted the world or she wanted Christ. Whether she wanted to serve God and go with Him, or she wanted to look back to the comfort of Sodom. And all of us have to have the decision that Lot made. Either I go with Christ and I don't know where I'm going. Talk about an interesting journey. When Lot left with his 2 daughters and the angels, man, this man had no clue. He had no clue where his journey was going to end. But he left. He left with God. Lot's wife turned back. In the book of Jasher, just looking it up, I find that Jasher calls Lot's wife Edo or Edith. Odo or Edith is the name they give for Lot's wife. The scriptures gives no name for Lot's wife, but I don't want to be like Edith. I don't want to be trapped between the world and Jesus. I want my life to be totally given over to Him. And it's scary because we don't know what that looks like. We want to be comfortable in the decisions we make and to be a sacrifice to Jesus, a living sacrifice, means I have to be willing to be uncomfortable. I have to be willing to be challenged, to be taken places I have never gone and places I never intend to go, and give up things that I never thought I would, and accept things that I didn't know I needed to. That's what this salt is about. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living, holy sacrifice, to be salted. You are the sacrifice, and when you present yourself as that sacrifice, God salts you. Acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. I'm looking up this idea of salt. Salt is really important. We are living sacrifices. And by us allowing God to change us, that salt represents us giving ourselves to Him wholeheartedly. Salt. Salt. Such a simple thing. You could say this is an imperfect illustration, an imperfect parable, because, of course, salt can't be diluted. It's always salt. You can only dilute seawater how? Adding more water. Right? You can't dilute seawater by just making the salt less salty. Interesting. There's one way to get salt out of water. What? Well, you're getting the water out of the salt. Right? Okay?
How did the axe float?
Well, okay. Well, now I don't know. But I would have taken an awful lot of salt. There's one other way to get water out of salt. You can freeze it out. Cold enough. The frozen. It's possible. But if you're so frozen, the salt is out of you, God be with you. If you're so frozen that the salt leaves you, yeah, what a cold heart. So Christ is asking us to keep through this simple parable, He's saying, sacrifice all for me. Totally surrender to me. Follow me all the way. Because otherwise, you're not a living sacrifice. You're just something else. Maybe you're a rock. Whatever rock that is, it's only good for the manure pile. Jesus says, when I come, I'm going to come, and I'm looking for salt. I'm looking for salt I'm looking for those people filled with salt. And that salt in you responds to me. It's pretty interesting. I'm just like, this is so beautiful. I don't want the world. I want Jesus. And Jesus is asking us to this parable, all of me, and let the world go. All the world, and let the world go. I want to sing one verse of my favorite song. And if you guys want to stand, because we sing better when we stand, we're going to do it. Guess what? It's Give Me Jesus. First verse of Give Me Jesus. So let's stand and we'll sing. In the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, in the morning when I rise, give me Jesus, give me Jesus, give me Jesus. You may have all this world, give me Jesus. Give me that salt. Just give me that salt. This salt won't kill you. You can't get too much. Let's bow our heads. Father, we want to be filled with your salt, with your presence. I pray that each one of us surrenders our heart, our lives, everything as a sacrifice to you, and are filled with your salt. In Jesus' name, amen.